GreyGray Tale-Tale.
Check it.
You know that feeling when you think your life is just ordinary, boring even, and then something happens that completely flips everything upside down. Well, let me tell you about the craziest 6 months of my life. But before I do that, subscribe. Like right now. So picture this, I'm 25, working as a personal assistant to this incredibly successful businessman. His name is Alexander Stone, and when I say he's loaded, I mean the man owns half the city. Skyscrapers, hotels, restaurants, you name it. And me? I'm just this regular girl from the suburbs trying to make ends meet in the big city. Now, Alexander Stone is exactly what you'd expect from a billionaire boss. Cold, demanding, never smiles. The kind of guy who expects his coffee at exactly 7:30 a.m., his meetings scheduled to the minute, and his dry cleaning picked up without being asked. I spent most days walking on eggshells around him, wondering if I'd make it through another week without getting fired. But here's where it gets interesting. About 2 months into the job, I started finding these little notes on my desk. Not from him, obviously, or so I thought. They were always handwritten on beautiful cream-colored paper, and they said the sweetest things. Things like how my smile brightened the entire office, or how graceful I looked when I was concentrating on work. First, I thought maybe it was the cute guy from accounting. You know how office crushes go. But these letters, they were different. They noticed things about me that I didn't even notice about myself. Like how I always tucked my hair behind my left ear when I was nervous, or how I hummed softly when I was happy. The letters kept coming, almost daily. Sometimes they'd be tucked between files I needed to review, sometimes slipped under my keyboard. Once, I even found one in my coat pocket after lunch. Whoever was writing them was paying very close attention to me, and honestly, it was both thrilling and a little scary. The mystery person started calling me Sunshine in the letters. Can you imagine? Me, Sunshine. I'd never thought of myself that way, but reading those words made me feel like maybe I actually was bright and warm and worth noticing. Meanwhile, work with Mr. Stone was getting more intense. Big merger coming up, longer hours, more pressure. But somehow, those daily letters were keeping me sane. They became the highlight of my day. I'd wake up excited, wondering what sweet message would be waiting for me. Then something weird started happening. I began noticing things about my boss that I'd never seen before, like how he always made sure the office temperature was just right, not too cold, not too warm. How he'd somehow arranged for my favorite coffee blend to always be stocked in the break room. Little things that made my job easier, but done so quietly I almost didn't notice. One evening, I was working late again trying to finish this presentation for the next morning. I was exhausted, stressed, probably looked like a mess. I stepped out to get some air on the office balcony, and when I came back, there was a cup of my favorite tea waiting on my desk. Still steaming hot. Fresh lemon slice, just how I liked it. The security guard was making his rounds, and I asked if he'd seen anyone come by my desk. He just shrugged and said Mr. Stone had been working late too, but hadn't seen anyone else around. That's when I started putting the pieces together. The timing of the letters, the little acts of kindness, the way Mr. Stone sometimes caught me reading them and would quickly look away. But it seemed impossible. This cold, intimidating businessman writing me love letters? No way. I decided to test my theory. The next morning, I made a comment about how much I loved jasmine flowers, just mentioned it casually while we were going over his schedule. 2 days later, there was a single jasmine flower on my desk with a note that said, "Beauty recognizes." Beauty! My heart was racing. It was him. It had to be him. But here's the thing, during the day, he was still the same demanding boss. If anything, he seemed even more distant, more professional. It was like he was two completely different people. The passionate man who wrote me poetry, and the stern businessman who barely acknowledged my existence. I started watching him more carefully, and slowly, I began to see cracks in his armor. The way his eyes would soften for just a moment when he thought I wasn't looking. How he'd pause just a little too long when handing me documents, like he wanted to touch my hand, but Didn't dare. The way he'd clear his throat whenever I laughed at something, like he was trying not to smile. The letters were getting more personal, more intimate. He wrote about dreaming of running his fingers through my hair, about imagining what it would be like to hold me, about how difficult it was to maintain professional distance when all he wanted was to tell me how he felt. Reading those letters, I was falling for him, hard. This mysterious, romantic side of him was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Thoughtful, observant, passionate. But how could I reconcile that with the cold man I worked for every day? Then came the night that changed everything. I was working late again, and I thought I'd lost an important contract. I was sitting at my desk, probably about to cry from frustration, when I heard footsteps. Mr. Stone appeared with the missing file in his hand. Instead of lecturing me about being careless, he set it down gently and asked if I was okay. His voice was different, softer, warmer. For the first time since I'd started working there, he actually seemed to see me as a person, not just an employee. I looked up at him, and something shifted. Maybe it was the late hour, maybe it was the stress, but suddenly all those carefully maintained boundaries just dissolved. He reached out and tucked that strand of hair behind my ear, the same gesture he'd written about in his letters. That's when I knew for sure. And somehow, he knew that I knew. We started dating secretly. Can you imagine? Sneaking around like teenagers, stealing moments between meetings, finding excuses to work late together. It was thrilling and terrifying and absolutely perfect. Away from the office, Alexander was everything those letters had promised. Funny, gentle, incredibly romantic. He'd surprise me with picnics on the roof of his building, send flowers to my apartment with notes that made me laugh, plan elaborate dates that felt like scenes from movies. He told me about his childhood, about the pressure of taking over the family business so young, about how lonely he'd been before I walked into his life. I understood then why he'd been so distant at work. He'd been protecting both of us from the complications of an office romance. For 3 months, we lived in this perfect bubble. I was completely, utterly in love with him, and he with me. We started talking about the future, about going public with our relationship, about how we'd handle the gossip and the judgment. Then reality came crashing down. I was in his office one afternoon, discussing some client files, when his assistant buzzed in to say his mother had arrived unexpectedly. Before either of us could react, this elegant, imposing woman swept into the office. Mrs. Eleanor Stone was everything you'd expect from billionaire royalty. Perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and perfectly terrifying. She barely glanced at me before dismissing me with a wave of her hand, like I was furniture. But as I was leaving, I heard her mention a name that made my blood run cold. Veronica Ashworth. I knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. Veronica Ashworth, daughter of another business empire, socialite, everything I was not. And from what I overheard, she was apparently Alexander's intended bride. I spent that night Googling everything I could find about Veronica Ashworth. She was gorgeous, educated, sophisticated, basically perfect for someone like Alexander. The articles talked about how the marriage would unite two of the most powerful families in the state, how it had been arranged years ago but was finally moving forward. When Alexander tried to call me that evening, I couldn't answer. My heart was breaking, and I needed time to process what I'd learned. The next few days at work were torture. He kept trying to talk to me, to explain, but I wasn't ready to hear it. How could he have been planning a future with me while being engaged to someone else? Finally, he cornered me in the break room. His face was desperate, tired, like he hadn't been sleeping. He explained everything. How the arrangement with Veronica was something his mother had orchestrated years ago, something he'd gone along with because it made business sense and he'd never cared enough about anyone to fight it. How meeting me had changed everything, but he'd been trying to find a way out of the engagement without destroying both families' businesses. He told me he'd been working with lawyers for weeks, trying to unravel the contracts and agreements. That he was willing to risk everything, his relationship with his mother, his business partnerships, his inheritance to be with me. But here's the thing about fairy tales, they don't always have fairy tale endings. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the realities of different worlds, family expectations, and billion-dollar consequences. I stood there listening to the man I loved tell me he was willing to give up everything for me. I realized I couldn't let him do it. I couldn't be the reason he lost his family, his life's work, everything he'd built. I made the hardest decision of my life. I told him I couldn't do it anymore, that the pressure, the secrecy, the complications were too much, that maybe we were just too different, from two different worlds. The look in his eyes when I said those words will haunt me forever. It was like watching someone's heartbreak in real time. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bear to see him every day, knowing what we'd had and what we'd lost. He tried to stop me, sent letters to my apartment, real ones this time, not secret notes begging me to reconsider. But sometimes love means making the sacrifice, even when it destroys you. It's been 6 months now. I found a new job, started rebuilding my life. I still think about him every day, still wonder if I made the right choice. Sometimes I see his name in the business papers, and my heart still skips a beat. I heard through mutual friends that he never went through with the marriage to Veronica. Apparently, he called it off completely, despite his mother's fury. Part of me wonders if things could have been different if I'd been braver, if I'd been willing to fight for us. But maybe some love stories aren't meant to have happy endings. Maybe they're meant to teach us about sacrifice, about what it means to love someone so much you're willing to let them go. I still have all his letters, tucked away in a box in my closet. Sometimes, on lonely nights, I read them and remember what it felt like to be someone's sunshine. And who knows? Maybe this isn't the end of our story. Maybe it's just the end of chapter 1. After all, the best love stories are the ones that find a way to surprise you.